prime thing is you have to win.
There you go. There you go. That's what I'm talking about. Hey, Mark, settle down a little bit.
Welcome back to the Just Win podcast. I'm Ted Win. That's Tashan Reed. The Raiders got their pads on and they are in training camp, and we could actually see some real football, or at least Tashan is watching some real football. But first, let's talk about the news that everyone is talking about, Kissgate, with Christian Wilkins. Adam Schefter reported that the incident that Josina was talking about, that happened between Christian Wilkins and another teammate, was that Wilkins kissed another teammate on the forehead in a joking manner. And Mike Florio from Pro Football Focus is saying that that isn't the incident, and that Schefter might be downplaying the incident. But regardless, there was something weird that happened with Christian Wilkins and another teammate. You want to fill us in on the details, Sean?
Yeah, so as Schefter reported, there was an incident in the team meeting room last week where Wilkins allegedly kissed a teammate on the head, and that teammate took offense to it, ended up proceeding to make an HR complaint. Um, as Florio insinuated, like the sense that I have is that's not the only incident of that vein that's happened since Christian Wilkins has joined the Raiders. And I know people have pulled a lot, on Twitter of things from him in game, both, in NFL with the Dolphins, and then also going back to his college years with Clemson, of him, doing weird stuff in the pile and whatnot. And so, he kind of has a history there of sort of, even if he thinks he's joking around or whatnot, doing things that sort of toe the line. And just to be clear, like, this isn't, the reason why the Raiders ultimately like moved on from Christian Wilkins. Like, it was a bigger thing that stems back to how he handled his foot injury. We reported last week that, the Raiders determined he needed a second surgery to repair that left foot earlier this offseason. He didn't want to. And that back and forth led them to void his guarantees in June. And it did kind of leave the question of, all right, well, if they voided his guarantees in early June, why did they wait till late July to release him? And or why did they release him at all, at that point? And it seems like this stuff, this sort of off the field conduct mixed in with the injury stuff, led them to decide that it was just time to cut bait from him. And so the outcome is still the same. Christian Wilkins is no longer a Raider, and he filed his grievance with the NFLPA, and that going to be a legal battle with the Raiders at some point down the line to try to get those guarantees back that they voided. But this adds a little bit more context in terms of why they decided to actually get him off the roster.
And obviously, like you mentioned, the main point is the foot surgery and him not wanting to have that surgery. But can this, the weird shenanigans going on with Wilkins, can that add to this case?
Yeah, like, you don't have to just highlight one reason to avoid guarantees or move on from a guy. Like, going back to Antonio Brown with that whole fiasco, like, they didn't just have one thing that they pointed to why they ended up voiding his guarantee. Like, there was a series of incidents, and they all were different in their own way, from the weird stuff with the feet to the incident with Mike Mayock, the former GM. And so it can be a combination of things. They don't just have to highlight one reason for that. And so if you're the Raiders, and you're gonna have to have a hearing where you make your case at some point about why you voided his guarantees and felt justified in doing so. Conduct detrimental to the team is kind of the bucket that falls under. And this sort of incident, something that escalates to the HR situation, would definitely fall under that umbrella. So I would say it all ties into it for sure.
Yeah, and obviously Pete Carroll and teammates, whenever they're asked about it, are pretty dismissive, and they're not going to talk about something like this out in the open. But it is interesting that Adam Butler, the Raiders' starting defensive tackle, went straight to a talk about mental health and getting help when you need it. When asked about the Wilkins situation, which I don't want to speculate too much, but that leads me to believe is a little bit more than some joking around incident that just happened.
Yeah, it was so vague and open ended. I don't want to like read too much into it, but it definitely seems like, at least from his opinion, that there's something larger on the Wilkins side that seems to be worked on. In terms of his personal mental health. But again, it was so non-specific that I don't want to go too far down the speculation path, but it definitely jumped out as the most interesting comment of the day yesterday because Pete Carroll pretty much said no comment, and then I think Jonah Laulu was also asked about it and pretty much said no comment as well. So Butler was really the only one who kind of gave you something that was a little bit interesting yesterday.
Yeah, well, since we got that out of the way, we kind of have to talk about it. Let's talk about training camp and what's going on in training camp. Like I mentioned, they're in pads now. They're hitting. We're seeing some real football. There's nowhere to hide. There's, some guys look good without pads, and some guys disappear when the pads come on. I think Jack Besh is a guy who is a guy that will show up when pads come on, but we'll talk about him a little bit more. I think one of the biggest stories that are is coming out right now is Jackson Powers Johnson and Jordan Meredith are rotating at center, and Pete Carroll came out and said they are in the actual competition. What do you make of that, and how have both players looked?
Yeah, so last week in practice before the pass came on, we had started to see that rotation with, JPJ handling starting center duties one day and then Jordan Meredith handling them the other day. And at first it kind of seemed like it was just, getting Meredith familiar with Geno Smith. They hadn't played before, and in case of injury, he could be one snap away from being a starting center. But what made it, interesting was when it continued into once they had on pads. JPJ was handled all the starter duties on Monday, and then Meredith had a shot at it on Tuesday. So they're pretty much alternating. And when they do rotate, because people have been asking, like it's not like one slides over the guard, like they just aren't in the starting lineup anymore. So when JPJ was at starting center, Meredith was just with the backups at center, and then when Meredith was starting, JPJ was with the backups at center. So it's not like a situation where they're trying them both out of guard or anything like that. At least so far in practice, like obviously that could change as training camp goes on. And last season Meredith started 8 games, I believe, at guard for the Raiders, and he was pretty solid. But Pete Carroll, when asked about why they're trying him at center, said that he cited that he's a little bit of a smaller guard, and he thinks that his build is more suited for center. And it is a position that he's taken practice reps at before, so it's not completely foreign to him. And so I still, in my opinion, like I think JPJ is going to end up being the starter there, but it is interesting, and I guess it fits with that overall, sort of message that Pete Carroll preaches of competing. Nobody's spot is guaranteed, and JPJ is a guy that we've pretty much had started in as a starter, since they moved on from Andre James this offseason, but clearly they're giving Meredith a shot to see if he can steal the job away.
Yeah, it's interesting because JPJ was a second round pick, highly regarded as a prospect around the league. Showed some real flashes last year, and honestly, if you look at every position on the line, he's the player with the highest ceiling. Like he could potentially be a top 10, top 5 type of guy at his position. And it is surprising that he is in competition, but I also think, like, I know you said they're not rotating at guard, but I think if they decide that Meredith can be a starting center, it wouldn't be that hard to slide JPJ at guard. I mean, I've talked about it. I think, JPJ could be a great guard. He has that size and power to be able to play that position. I know he prefers center, but it's about getting your best 5 out there. And JPJ is without a doubt one of your top 5. So it's hard to imagine if Meredith is the starting center that JPJ just sits on a bench. It could also be a motivational tactic from Pete Carroll. Maybe he really believes that, JPJ can be a great one of the great centers, and he's just trying to push and get the most out of him possible. But I do think that there could be potential for JPJ to move to center if and move to guard if they decide that Meredith has potential to be a good starting center. Because I do believe they do like his potential, and I agree with Pete Carroll's comment that he's a technically sound, good player, but he is light and he doesn't have that power that you typically want from a guard.
Yeah, like I don't see a world really where JPJ is just a backup, right? I think, the point of having them both locked in at center is to, get them both the most reps possible at that position, whether they're with the starters or the backups, so you can see who's better at that spot. But like you said, we saw JPJ play both guard spots last season, and whether it's left guard or right guard, if Meredith does end up becoming the starting center, I think we'll see JPJ play guard. And Speaking of Adam Butler kind of having these suggestive comments, like yesterday, he also mentioned that he thinks JPJ is going to be all pro guard one day, like not center, which I thought
Really?
was kind of interesting. I don't know if that was a slip of the tongue or not, but yeah, so we'll see.
All right. See, I told you, man. JPJ guard. I like that position for him, but I know he prefers center. But we'll see how it plays out. But the intention is to get the best five on the field. And there's some different lineups that we could see, and maybe the starting five at the beginning of the year might not be the starting five by the middle of the season. We'll see. There'll definitely be some shuffling in the preseason. Um, Next topic, Dante Thornton. He was a guy that really stood out in OTAs, and he's continuing to play well into training camp when the pads have come on. I know he caught that 60-yard touchdown yesterday from Geno Smith. Could you tell us a little bit about that play and how he's doing overall?
Yeah, so that was on Monday actually that he had that bomb. It looked like a post route. It was like a 3-by-1 concept, and they had him one-on-one with Darian Porter, so it was speed on speed there. And Thornton managed to pretty much just run past him, and Smith, he was a little bit behind him, but it was pretty much in stride because he was able to catch it, turn, and keep running and pull it away from Porter for a touchdown. And he's a guy that he's made those plays pretty consistently since OTAs, and it was definitely encouraging for the Raiders to see that continue once the pass came on. At the Tuesday's practice, he also had a nice touchdown catch during red zone drills over the middle that was more of a shorter route. So he's made plays, not just on the deep shots, but also shorter to intermediate routes, which he said that's really been an area of focus for him because, pretty much at Tennessee, he was strictly a deep shot guy or maybe like a really quick, route kind of guy. And he's trying to work on that medium to intermediate route running to take his game to the next level. But he's been pretty much locked in as their starting X receiver to this point. And Geno Smith clearly trusts him, and they've already worked out a pretty good chemistry already. And Thornton, when he talked the other day, he said that Smith told him that if he's one-on-one, he's going to look his way. And it's a pretty big vote of confidence in a rookie, especially a guy that he hasn't been around that long. And so, it's been a pretty strong offseason for him and in practice. We'll see if he's able to translate it once the preseason game starts and obviously going into the season. But pretty encouraging so far for the fourth round pick.
Yeah, the problem with receivers and quarterbacks that come out from that Tennessee system, they run us offense called the deep choice offense, where you're running a deep route and you can run maybe three or four different options off of that deep route, and it's kind of like a play style type of football when you break it down. So you're running routes and you're making reads that you just aren't going to do in the league, and it's kind of like a free flow thing. So it's difficult to make that transition into a pro style offense when you have to learn a ton of different plays, more precise routes, and I think that's the challenge for Thornton, is to really pick those things up and really hone down on those details. But the good news is the Raiders don't need him to be that complete receiver right away. They need that deep threat guy, that guy who could catch that deep post and run fade routes when the offense is the defense compacts in to stop the run game or stop Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers underneath. Another guy, Jack Besh, who fits that profile of that slot receiver, and we kind of talked about the challenge with him. It's kind of finding a role in this offense when there's so many guys kind of doing similar things to him. But he's kind of stood out in these padded practices. What have you seen from him?
Yeah, so he's still, primarily working with the backups to this point. Like he's getting a little bit more starting reps. But we're seeing him working at the slide and also outside. And Monday he had a nice catch in red zone drills where he got open on the out breaking route and Aiden O'Connell hit him for a touchdown. And the cornerback managed to like close out right when the ball arrived and make some contact with those pads on, but he still held on to the ball through the ground. And T. Carroll, spoke pretty highly of him yesterday after practice. Said he really stepped up his game once the pass came on, which makes sense. I mean, he's a guy that's really physical, not just as a route runner, but he's also one of the better run blockers that they have at receiver. So even if he's not a starter as a rookie, which it seems like that's a little bit unlikely at this point, he'll still be in the rotation at receiver. Obviously, nobody's just playing three receivers the entire season. There's too many snaps to go around, and then also when they are in those more obvious running situations, it makes sense to have him in there along with Jacoby Myers is probably their two best run blocking receivers. So he'll have a role. Maybe not what people expected out of a second round pick, but he's showing some progress these last few practices.
Yeah, and speaking of blocking, we've been talking about a potential for a great 12 personnel uh, package for the Raiders. Last year, that didn't come into fruition. They just weren't good enough at run blocking to really create the mismatches you want out of 12 personnel. But Chip Kelly's a guy who really has used his tight ends at his time in college, and we're starting to see it in training camp, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, that was the vision last year. Obviously, they got derailed, as you mentioned, because they couldn't run the ball, but also, Michael Mayer missed a few games due to personal reasons. And he really didn't really look like himself in the 11 games that he did play. And he spoke to the media the other day and he said, you feel like this is the best he's felt, across the board, mentally, emotionally, physically. He feels like he's back to being himself. And he's performed pretty well since OTAs. And they've been using 12 personnel pretty often in practice with both him and Bowers out there on the field together. And, he looks pretty good. And, if they can do better from a run blocking standpoint and make teams actually have a reason to respect it, I think we'll actually see that personnel grouping the way we sort of expected to see it last season. Also, in part because the receiver group just doesn't have that depth to constantly be rolling out, three receiver, four receiver sets all the time. So I think Michael Mayer could end up being a better receiving option, maybe than their, fourth receiver in the rotation, for example. So, I think we'll see it, a little bit more if he continues to make progress like we've seen so far in practice. And Chip Kelly, like you mentioned, especially his last year at Ohio State when he won a national championship, that was his second most used personnel group with 12 personnel. So that's something that he wants to do, and we'll see if that translates once the game starts.
Yeah, like you mentioned, the receiver group isn't a deep group for the Raiders. I mean, unless somebody like Dante Thornton or Jack Besh has a huge breakout at receiver, this team really has to create an advantage at 12 personnel. And that starts with being able to run the ball better. That starts with Michael Mayer being a bigger threat at receiver than he has been. We know Brock Bowers is going to be one of the top tight ends. I mean, he was rated the top tight end by league executives. So, yeah, 12 personnel has to be an advantage personnel group for this team if this offense is going to be the type of team that offense that they want to be. And another player who really is supposed to shine when the pads come on is running back Ashton Genty. Um, Obviously, one of his best traits is being able to break tackles and stay on balance. How has he looked so far?
Yeah, so they're not, live tackling to the ground, at least so far, like they were last year out in Costa Mesa. So we're not seeing him quite replicate running the ball yet. But you can see that explosiveness, when the offensive line during team drills create a hole, he's able to explode through it pretty quickly, and you can, even though they're not tackling him, and it's not, super realistic. Like you can tell, it would have been a chunk gain just because of his acceleration and his explosiveness, and so and we've all seen him working as a receiver as well. We've talked about that, not just out of the backfield, but also line up in the slot or split out wide. So they're going to get creative with how they use him, and I think especially if they end up not being the best run blocking team again, that's probably going to be a way where he gets a lot of his touches is through the pass game on those shorter passes and maybe some downfield passes as well. And so he's looked, pretty solid. It probably won't really be until the preseason games that we're able to see like really what he can do as a runner. Because breaking tackles and his contact balance is such a big part of his game, and they're just not going to be tackling that guy during practice. So early signs are encouraging. The coaches have good things to say about him in terms of how he's learning the system and working on his pass blocking technique, but really won't be able to see the full Genty experience until we see some preseason games get started.
Yeah, I think I'm really encouraged by the clips I've seen of him running routes. I mean, it's one thing to be able to catch the ball, but it's another skill to be a good route runner from the backfield. And the routes he's run looked really smooth. He had one where he ran kind of this fake choice route vertical from the backfield, and he did kind of like this hezzy skip when he was faking the choice route, and it looked just like Christian McCaffrey ran it. And later that day, the Niners actually posted a Christian McCaffrey clip of him running the same route, and he did almost the same skip step. So I thought that was kind of cool to see. But He also talked about how the Raiders are lining him in a slot, lining him out wide. So, you know, being able to have a back that can run legitimate routes and really put linebackers in a blender is such a huge advantage. Some teams that, they do it during the offseason, but when the bullets start flying, they kind of go away from it. So I hope Chip Kelly continues to do this in game, because I feel like that's how you really get the most out of Ashton Genty, is taking advantage of him in the pass game as well. So that's a good thing to see for the Raiders. And yeah, especially if you pick a back that high, he has to be able to be a weapon in a pass game. And so far, it looks like Genty is going to be one.
All right, so after Ted and I recorded today's episode of the Des Win podcast, the Raiders had some news break. They signed left tackle Kolton Miller to a 3-year, $66 million contract with $42.5 million guaranteed. We had talked about Miller's situation a few times on this podcast recently. He was going into the final year of his contract that he signed back in 2021. He was set to make a little bit over $12 million, and that put him around 15th amongst left tackles. And, while he had a bumpy season coming off an injury last year, typically he's an above average left tackle. He's only 29 years old. And so it just made sense for the Raiders to get a deal done here. And we've seen this left tackle market really sort of, it jumps every year, but it jumped again this year. And we've seen some deals get done recently. Rashawn Slater with the Chargers found a huge 4-year, $114 million deal. Just a couple of days ago, Bernhard Raymond from the Colts signed a 4-year, $100 million deal. And so you've seen five left tackles actually get deals worth in excess of $20 million per year in average annual salary before this Miller deal got done. And so left tackles, they're one of the most important positions in football. He was only going to get more expensive. He was set to be a free agent next year. And, you could say coming off a down year, maybe they should have waited and see if he's still the same Colton Miller before committing to him long term. But if he went out there and had a great season this year, he's going to get even more expensive next year. And so it made sense to commit to him. He's a guy that he's only missed 7 games in his 8-year career. He's been pretty durable outside of that shoulder injury that hampered him during 2023 and also 2024. And he's been fully healthy this year. He's been full go throughout OTAs and training camp, and he's looking like the old Colton Miller again. And so the guys feel comfortable pulling the trigger on this and getting this done. And it comes out to an average of $22 million per year. But this is also on top of his previous year that he still had left. So now he's under contract through the 2028 season. So essentially, Colton Miller's under contract through the next 4 seasons now at a pretty affordable number when you take it into full account. It's below some of those other deals that got done. He'll be somewhere in the top 10 amongst left tackles in terms of average annual salary, I'm sure, but that won't last long, because those guys reset the market pretty much every time they sign. So it's going to go down and get cheaper over time. And so I think this is a win-win for both sides. For Colton Miller, he's the longest tenure Raider remaining left with the franchise. He gets that long-term security he was looking for. He didn't plan on going anywhere. He didn't want to go anywhere. He only wants to play for the Raiders. He said that before. And, with the Raiders, you get at least an above average left tackle that you can depend on locked up for the foreseeable future. Obviously, his primary job was to, protect the quarterback, Geno Smith, but also making a difference in the run game and just overall lifting the offensive line. And Miller, he's a quiet guy, but he's a locker room leader. He's well-liked. He's respected. And so, again, this is a deal that just makes sense from all parties. And, we just a few months ago, we kind of didn't know how this was going to go because Colton Miller initially didn't report for OTAs, and it was as he was seeking a new contract, and the Raiders didn't seem willing to play ball at that point. And he actually ended up just deciding to end his holdout and report it to camp before he missed any practices. He also didn't get a new deal. With the first year regime, kind of filling each other out, a new GM and general manager, John Spytek, a new head coach, and Pete Carroll. These guys don't really know each other. And so they wanted to get him. And I know they did Max Crosby's deal, but it's different when you're, arguably a top 3, top 5 player at your position. Like, I don't necessarily need to get to know you to sign you to an extension. But when you're talking about a guy like Miller, who's more in that above average to good range, you kind of want to do a little bit more research, see where he's at in terms of where his body is, how he performs, how he fits. And so through OTAs and early in training camp, they saw enough. And then I think also seeing some of these deals get done, this past week, drive up the market, gave them that final push that they needed to go ahead and get him locked up. And so, yeah, we got an active past news week for the Raiders, and this time it's a bit of positive news. Getting their left tackle locked up for the foreseeable future.
All right, so let's talk about Geno Smith. He's had some good days, and he has some days where he's throwing interceptions. It's a mixed bag, and it's kind of be to be expected when you're learning offense and totally new teammates. What have you seen from Geno Smith?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like he's sort of trying things out there, seeing what he can get away with, what he can't get away with. He's still in the process of learning this team and getting familiar with his teammates as well. Being that this is his first year with the Raiders, and so wouldn't overreact to it too much. You still see those flashes of, what made them take this bet on him. He just posted early this morning a nice pass that he had on Monday where he threw a over the shoulder pass to Brock Bowers on Decamian Richardson, and it was good defense, but he with the ball placement, he was able to make it better offense. And you've seen him make those throws pretty consistently throughout training camp and OTAs, and so the talent is there. It's just a matter of him getting comfortable and familiar. And I think he'll be ready to go by the time the season rolls around. But it hasn't been, what has been in training camp out of the quarterbacks the last couple of years where he's basically a disaster with 3 or 4 interceptions every day. Like it's nothing like that. He just gets got a couple times. Like on practice on Tuesday, Devin White managed to pick him off, and it seemed like he didn't see him when he made the throw. So stuff like that is happening, but it's nothing to be alarmed about, in my opinion.
The previous quarterbacks made Jack Jones seem like he was going to be Deion Sanders in training camp. So it's good that that's not happening, and they're at least moving the ball and while in the process of learning this new offense. Um, a player that has stood out to you, Devin White. I think Pete Carroll's mentioned him. Pete Carroll said, he was on top of the world a few years ago, and he's getting back to that. But I mean, he honestly he was not that good even in his at least in coverage in his heyday, even with Tampa Bay. But it doesn't mean that he can't improve. He had some time off, and maybe he's looking to improve on those areas that he was weak in before.
Yeah, so he talked to us on Tuesday as well, and he spoke about, kind of that last year in Tampa Bay in 2023, ironically, when John Spytek was there as the assistant general manager, now the Raiders GM. And he said he was so focused on the contract situation that it sort of got him out of his head a little bit. And he was also dealing with some off the field stuff. He had lost his father recently, and that put him in a dark place mentally. And then he had that foot injury that he suffered that caused him to miss a few games that season, and it actually carried over into last season. He ended up getting cut by the Eagles, and then the Texans he barely played, partly as a result of that foot injury. And so, between mental stuff and physical stuff, he just wasn't himself the last couple of years. And he said he actually considered stepping away from the game before he locked back in and decided to give it another go. And so, but he's been playing pretty well with the Raiders against his practice. But whether it's as a pass rusher, run defense and pass coverage, like he's been pretty solid overall. Um, like I mentioned, he had that pick against Geno Smith in the end zone yesterday, and he also registered what would have been a sack on a blitz as well later on in practice. And but he's still been running with the starters as that will linebacker, even though they've added Jermaine Pratt and Jamal Adams. They have him converting down from safety to linebacker. Part of that is Pratt and Adams weren't around during OTAs, and so they're still learning Patrick Graham's system and trying to get up to speed. So we'll see if that remains the case as we get deeper into training camp. But he's trying to do everything he can to win that starting job, and it sounds like Pete Carroll's been pretty pleased with what he's seen so far.
And Tommy Eichenberg is that third linebacker in those base packages, right?
Yeah. At least the last couple of days, they were out there. When they don't really go to 3 linebackers that often, but when they do, which they might do a little bit more often since they have that kind of questionable nickelback situation, they've been bringing him in off the bench. Again, we'll see like as Pratt and Adams get more familiar if that remains the case. But he was a guy, he's a high day 3 pick last year, and we didn't really get to see much out of him. He didn't play much, and so uh, this is a very veteran heavy linebacker room, but at least one of these young guys, are trying to get in the mix there and maybe make the roster. So maybe he'll end up being the one.
Yeah, and another position group that is questionable that could use some surprising breakouts is the cornerback group. Um, the Camryn Richardson didn't play a lot last year, but he seems like a guy that's been standing out in camp.
Yeah, he's actually Devin White's cousin. He said he's been pretty hard on him. They've been riding to practice every day, I guess. But he the last couple practices in particular, he's been running with the starters pretty often. I would say it's been in the kind of a three-man rotation between him, Eric Stokes, and Darian Porter. Brian Bennett has been pretty firmly the fourth cornerback. He's been playing pretty well in practice, so it seems it might just be a preference thing. We'll hit on that a little bit more later, but I think Richardson played really well. He had a pick on Smith in the red zone. Trey Tucker flashed open in the back of the red zone, and Smith tried to fit it in there, and DCam did a good job of jumping it and picking it off. And he's been pretty sticky in coverage. He hasn't looked lost how he did last year. He has all the physical traits. He's 6'3", ran a 4.3 40, athletic, long. So he's that Pete Carroll type of cornerback that he looks for. It's just a matter of he can put all those traits together and perform consistently when he's out there on the field. And he's looked pretty good. Both Patrick Graham and Pete Carroll have had good things to say about him. And he's going to try to push for that starting role or one of those starting roles that they have available at outside corner.
Yeah, it's an interesting corner group. Just a lot of talent, but a lot. These guys just don't have a lot of experience. I talked to the defensive coach about Eric Stokes, and he just thinks that Stokes didn't have enough reps yet. So he's been dealing with injuries, and we'll see if he can get that with the Raiders and really break through. But yeah, I mean, it's just a lot of height, a lot of speed, a lot of talent in that group. But we'll see if one or two of these guys could put it together. Interestingly enough, I think Jacorian Bennett might be the most productive of that group. When he was playing, like how many plays on a ball he had. So, but like you said, he's a fourth corner right now. But I'm sure there'll be a lot of movement in that position group as we get into the preseason and into the season. All right, last topic. Before we get to questions, Eric Allen is getting inducted to the Hall of Fame on Saturday. He's been a guest on our pod, and he was great. And I know you just wrote an article about Eric Allen. You want to tell us a little bit about Allen, his career, and then him getting inducted?
Yeah, so I talked to him for a while, kind of just about his journey to Canton and his prime fame with the Eagles. He's got made multiple all-pro teams. It was one of the best cornerbacks in the league, but um, he hit sort of this mid-career lull with the New Orleans Saints, and it was pretty rough. He got into a Mike Ditka, and they almost came to blows. And then he requested a trade, or he said he was going to retire if they didn't trade him. And he was sort of one of those cast-offs. The Raiders have a few of these guys that land with them late in their careers and sort of revive their career. And he was part of that run that they had in John Gruden's first step. Breaking through to make the playoffs. And at least when Eric Allen was on the team, the first they got was um, advancing to the AFC Championship game against the Ravens that they ended up losing. But he said he felt like those years were really cemented him as a Hall of Famer. He actually tore his ACL in his first year with the Raiders, but then bounced back and was one of the best cornerbacks in the league again at 35 years old. And that really gave him that longevity he needed to get over the hump. Because if he just had that prime with the Eagles, like we've seen guys all the time, they have those all pro peaks, but they flame out after 7 or 8 years and they'll never touch the Hall of Fame. But he felt like it was that stint with the Raiders that really got him over the edge. And he'll get inducted on Saturday. I believe it was his 19th year of eligibility, so he had to wait a while. That's something that's pretty typical for a lot of Raiders greats, to the chagrin of their fan base. But yeah, man, shouts to EA. Appreciate him coming on the show last year, and it's gonna be good to see him finally get in there.
You know who's introducing him?
I don't actually. I'm not sure.
I wonder if it's going to be somebody related to the Raiders. But yeah, congratulations to Eric Allen, another Raider cornerback in the Hall of Fame. But let's get into some questions. First question from Lead Tier. Does Pete's history give us any clues to how many snaps starters get in the preseason?
Well, typically, at least his last few years with the Seahawks, he would pretty much rest the starters the first two games, and then he would play them in the third game to get them some live action before the season started. And so it doesn't guarantee that's how he's going to do it this year with the Raiders. He hasn't really specified yet. They do open the preseason next week against his old team, the Seattle Seahawks, up in Seattle. So that'll get our first look at seeing how he manages the preseason with the Raiders. But typically, he waits until that that third game to play the starters. But maybe a little bit different with this team just because it's so young that some of their quote unquote starters are guys that are like rookies or second year players that need those reps. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see maybe some more starters mixed in there than he has played in the past.
Yeah, I think I would assume we're going to see guys like Eric Stokes and that cornerback position. All those guys really play because it's such a um, position of need, and those guys are probably pretty close, I imagine. Maybe we see JPJ and we see Meredith out there, even if Geno Smith is not out there with them in those first couple of games. But so much now it's depends on joint practices, and teams really use joint practices as kind of a preseason game. The Raiders have one against the Niners, so that'll be fun to see. But I would imagine at least in the first game, you're not going to see many starters. Next question from Raider Mez 642. How do you guys see the linebacker room shaking out with so many experienced players in the room? How many linebackers do you see making a roster?
That's a tough one. I think Pete Carroll, the number he threw out there yesterday is he thinks they could keep as many as I think 6 guys. But it is a pretty, it's a guy. Well, it's not like the highest ceiling group, but it is a deep group. They have a lot of guys that have been starters before and have that kind of experience. We talked about, four of them pretty extensively: Landon Roberts, Devin White, Jermaine Pratt, and Jamal Adams are kind of the four upper tier veterans in the group. But then you have young guys like Tommy Eichenberg or maybe Amari Gaynor, who made the roster last year, that could potentially sneak in there. So I think it'll probably end up being 5 or 6 guys. But the other factor in that is with the NFL moving that touchback line on the kickoff up to the 35. Like I know last year we expected to see a lot more kickoff returns, but I think this year, like we'll actually see it because 35 is pretty harsh, and I don't think teams are just gonna take that. So I think we're gonna see more kickoffs, and linebackers typically have that body type that you want on your coverage team. And so it's not just about the guys that are gonna line up on the defense, it's the guys that could also make a difference on special teams. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's a pretty healthy number of linebackers that end up making the team.
It seems to me Landon Roberts is, I wouldn't say penciled in as a starter, but he's probably going to be a starter. He has experience in Graham's defense. He's been here all off season, and he's a guy that you could move up to the line of scrimmage and shift those fronts like we talked about if you want. And then the other spot with White and Pratt is, I think it's going to either be either one of those two. I think those two will probably be competing as Pratt kind of learns his defense a little bit more. But yeah, good point with the kickoff rules and keeping more linebackers for that kickoff. Next question: if Bennett is not a fit in Carroll's eyes, do you think they could trade him by Marines Jose?
Yeah, like I mean, if it just comes down to a thing where they just don't think he's tall enough or whatever it is, I don't see why you just keep him on the roster if you're not going to play him. So I would say so. And like you said, I think he's at least watching practices. He's made the most plays on the ball, in my opinion. He just doesn't have those measurables that the other guys have. Like he's fast. Like he ran a 4.3 40, and he can jump out the gym. So he has a ton of athleticism, but he's a little bit shorter. He's like 5'10", and he's a guy that he's never really played nickel before, and he hasn't played nickel in practice. So it's not like you just we'll just kick him over to nickel since he's smaller. At least we haven't seen that to this point. But if they're going to keep him outside only and they're going to have him, down the line as the fourth cornerback on the roster, like obviously you don't trade him just to trade him. But if there is a team that's willing to offer some, whether it's a player or some intriguing draft capital, I think that'd be a better option than just keeping him, buried on the depth chart.
Yeah, but corner depth is so important. It's like offensive line depth. You don't really trade quality guys at those positions, just because like if one goes down and you have to put a guy that is below average, it really exposes your whole unit. So um, I don't know if they trade him unless somebody really wants him and offers something unexpected. Um, but I would imagine he's still going to be on a team during the season. Any updates on the competition at nickel by Purple Cha Alien?
It's not really a competition. It's really just been Jeremy Chin when they do have a nickel on the field. Like he's pretty consistently been the nickelback. You've seen Darnay Holmes in there like occasionally, but Usually, if they want a nickel, they bring down Jeremy Chin as the big nickel, and then they bring a third safety on the field, whether that's Lonnie Johnson Jr. or somebody else to pair up with Isaiah Polamau. And so that's really been it. Chin, that's a role that he's had throughout his career before, so it's not new to him. It's something he's done before. And so, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's too much of a competition, but when he's not out there, it's been Darnay Holmes. So it seems like those are the two options that they're rolling with at this point anyway. So we'll see if that changes later on in training camp, but that's pretty much been it.
All right. Next question. Haven't heard too much about our safeties. How are they looking? And our offensive line by Mr. Sir Raider.
So yeah, I kind of mentioned Chin there. I think he's looked good, bouncing back and forth between multiple spots, showing his versatility off. And pulling out, he's looked pretty good as well. They haven't had too many deep shots allowed throughout practice. We've seen a few here and there, which is going to happen if you have only one single high safety and kind of playing man coverage in other spots. And so I think the safeties have been pretty solid so far. In terms of the offensive line, this week was really the first time we got to evaluate them much. I didn't see too much in terms of them creating space in the run game. But again, it's just kind of hard to, or you can see if they get pushed back or if they create a hole, but it's not like a true run player. So it's kind of hard to fully evaluate it. But they've been solid in run blocking and in pass protection. I would say the same thing. Like we've seen a couple sacks get through. Like Max Crosby had a sack the first day, and Devin White had a sack the second day. But it hasn't been like there's just been constant pressure in the face of the quarterbacks. And so whether it's JPJ or Meredith out there at center, the group overall has played pretty well. And so I think it's been solid for the offensive line. And same thing goes for the safeties as well.
Yeah. And last question by CTW Jones. Any under the radar players making a good impression?
Oh, first practice, Jaw Joyner looked pretty good in individual drills. He's a young, undrafted free agent defensive end that they have. I don't know how much of a shot he has in making the roster, but he could be a guy worth fashion on the practice squad. Um, in terms of like unproven guys, I'm trying to think like who else is really.
I think he mentioned Greedy. I think he may
Yeah,
have
you
had
mentioned
an
him, but
before.
I don't really see much of him in terms of like practice. Like he gets out there when the backups are out there, but I haven't noticed him like making a ton of plays or anything like that. But I trust Pete Carroll's eyes over mine, so maybe he's seen something. But that's another undrafted, free agent guy. He's been playing backup nickel for them, so he's one of the reserve guys at nickel. So could be a guy to keep an eye on if he does end up making progress enough to get some reps out there, especially in preseason games. That's the type of guy's going to get probably a lot of snaps. We'll be able to see what he has, but that's probably a couple guys, a couple undrafted free agents. Offensively, not really. There hasn't been much room for. There's been pretty much known commodities on offense, so it seems like more so is defense where it might be some opportunity for those guys to get into the mix.
Got it. All right. That's all we have for you guys today. Just make sure you guys subscribe, hit the like button on YouTube, subscribe and leave reviews on Spotify and Apple. That would really help us out. We're really hoping to get this podcast rolling this season. And yeah, hopefully it's a good Raider season and hopefully it's a good season for the Just Win podcast as well. We will talk to you guys soon.
All right, y'all. Peace.